Thank you for joining me for my Making a Reticule series. Today I will be sewing my reticule together. I have my beaded portion of silk and I'm going to cover it with another piece of silk. This is going to be the back of the reticule. I'll flip that over, make sure that both pieces are aligned. I want to make sure I've got enough seam allowance to sew these together, and I'm just going to pin the two pieces together, right sides together, so my beading will be on the inside. I'm going to cut excess fabric off so it's not unwieldy when I sew. This is my lining fabric. I'm going to fold it so that both sides are together. I want to make sure that's nice and flat. And now I'm going to lay my two outside pieces to it. So I've got my two right side pieces, right sides together. I've got my two inside pieces, right side together. I'm just going to pin both layers together to make sure that they are secure. And I'm going to cut off any excess fabric. Here you can see both layers pinned together. To provide more tension while I am sewing the straight lines of my reticule, I'm going to use a third hand or sewing clamp and just clamp that right to my sewing table. To sew the reticule together, I'm going to be using a combination of back stitches and spaced back stitches. So I'm going to start off my seam with a tack stitch, just a plain tack stitch, and then I'm going to go into my closely sewn back stitch near the top of the seam before I then use a spaced back stitch for the rest of the seam. I will continue sewing with a spaced back stitch around the perimeter of the reticule. If I run out of thread, I'll knot the thread off and start a new line of stitching, but I don't need to tie off at any point. So I'm just going to use one seam to construct this bag. I am coming to the end of my seam, so I'm going to knot off my thread at the top of that side seam and cut my thread, and my bag seam is complete. Now that the bag construction is done, I can trim off any extra fabric, leaving about a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Here it's about a 1/4 of an inch. I'm just eyeballing that seam allowance that I am leaving on. I'm going to cut it nice and close, and then I'm going to clip my curves with a sharp pair of scissors. So I clip my curves to make sure that my fabric can bend around that curved seam without puckering or gapping. To turn my bag right side out, I'm going to grab one lining edge. I'm going to fold it, or kind of turn the bag inside out. This is going to have a lining on both sides. Then I'm going to put my hand between my two outside fabric pieces, push the edges out a little bit, grab the inside, and pull it right side out. So this method of construction leaves no raw edges inside my bag. It is fully finished inside my reticule. I'm going to further push out the corners of my reticule using the squared handle of a crochet hook that I have lying around. I'm going to manipulate the fabric, make sure everything looks nice and crisp before going on to my next step. This is the one seam construction reticule. Now I can move on to my next step. I'm going to now fold down my facing using the basting transfer line that delineated the top edge of my reticule. I'm going to mark down the 2 inches of that reticule facing with pins on both sides, making sure not to get it through all 4 layers, just 2 layers. I'm going to fold it over on the back side, but since I don't have that basting line, I want to make sure that I mark how far from the top of my fabric that basting line is. So I've marked that width of the basting line. Then from that measurement, I'm going to mark down 2 inches. It should line up with those pins. This is going to give me the top fold of my reticule. And now I'm going to fold down my fabric using the pins as a guide. I am going to secure the top fold with pins so that I can turn the bag inside out and sew the facing down in place. Because I don't want my facing edge to be raw, I am going to use my basting marking line to fold under that seam allowance, and then I will pin that in place to sew. I will now use a catch stitch to catch the lining to the folded edge of the facing to hold it in place. This will not show on the outside of the reticule because I am only catching the lining and the facing fabric. I am now going to rip out my basting stitches now that I've sewn down my facing and my side seam. I like to use a silk thread for basting because it won't leave any indentations or marks when you pull out the thread, which is why I really recommend using that silk thread for basting. The last step for this bag is to create a closure method. So I'm going to be sewing some gold rings to the inside of the bag to act as a drawstring for the reticule. So right now I'm just marking out the placement for those rings. I'm going to have 8 in total that I sew down. And these are my rings. So this is it for the bag construction. I have one more step. I'm going to be adding on tassels to my reticule, so stay tuned for my next video where I'm going to show you how to make your own tassels and how to attach them. Thank you again for watching. You can subscribe or hit that like button, and I'll see you next time.